You don't expect your life to unravel on a Wednesday afternoon while stuck at a red light behind a landscaping truck. But sometimes it doesn't take a catastrophe, just a glimpse. In hindsight, Megan was always on the edge, restless, flirty, drawn to attention like a moth circling a fire. But I loved her. God help me, I loved her. That day started like any other. I had to drop off a document at a warehouse across town, nothing major, just some invoices that needed a signature. I was coming back down High Street around 3 p.m., caught in post-lunch traffic, when I saw a white Lexus coupe roll up next to me at a light. I wasn't paying attention at first. I was answering a quick text from a client. But something caught my eye, a familiar shape in the passenger seat, a tilt of the head, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It was Megan, laughing, relaxed, wearing a black blouse she only ever put on for special occasions. The man driving her car was maybe mid-30s, sunglasses on, arm casually draped across the steering wheel. And they were too close, too casual, too intimate for colleagues. I didn't act right away. I didn't honk or roll down the window. I just stayed completely still, heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to shatter my ribs. They didn't see me. They were too wrapped up in their little world, and when the light turned green, they turned left while I kept going straight. But I turned my head as they passed, memorizing the license plate like it was tattooed across my vision. Ohio tags. White Lexus. I whispered the number over and over like a curse, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I drove straight home and didn't even take off my shoes before grabbing a pen and writing the number down. I circled it, then sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for 10 minutes, feeling like the floor beneath me was no longer solid. The house was too quiet. Megan had said she was on a double shift at the hospital. She always said that. Her schedule was erratic enough to make it plausible, and I never had a reason to question her, until now. The version of her I saw in that car didn't match the one I'd kissed goodbye that morning. She'd been all business before she left, half a slice of toast in her mouth, mumbling about being tired, rushing out the door without even checking her reflection. But in that car, she looked alive. Bright. Beautiful. Like the best version of herself had been saved for someone else. I tried to shake it off. Told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was a coworker. But my gut knew better. That wasn't the laugh of someone sharing a ride. That was the laugh of someone deep in something she didn't want me to know about. That night, she came home at 11:47 p.m., keys jingling like always. She kissed me on the cheek, told me it was a brutal shift, and collapsed on the couch. I brought her water. She thanked me, said she missed me, said we needed a weekend away. I nodded, numb. I couldn't confront her yet. Not with nothing. I needed facts. Proof. I needed to be sure before I set fire to everything we built. The next morning, I contacted an old friend, James. We hadn't spoken in years, but he'd worked private security before, and last I checked, he'd been doing some PI work under the radar. I didn't go into details. Just told him I suspected something and gave him the plate number. Can you find out who owns it? I asked. He didn't even hesitate. Give me a day, he replied. I didn't sleep that night. Megan was beside me in bed, breathing evenly, completely unaware that I was watching her the way a hunter watches something wild just before pulling the trigger. The next day, James called back. Lexus is registered to a Travis Bennett, he said. 35. Works in IT for some insurance company. Lives about 15 minutes from your place. No record. Pretty clean. You want me to look into him more? I said yes. Of course I did. I wanted to know everything. What he looked like. Where he worked. If he was married. If he had kids. I needed context. I needed to know what kind of man was good enough for my wife to risk everything. James said he'd get back to me in a few days. I thanked him and hung up. My hands were shaking again. That weekend, Megan was different. Kinder. Almost doting. She cooked breakfast. Put her phone face up on the counter. Told me she was thinking of taking fewer shifts to spend more time at home. It felt rehearsed. Like she knew something was off and was trying to cover her tracks. I played along, smiled, nodded, kissed her back. But my stomach churned every time she touched me. It wasn't real anymore. I'd seen too much. Known too much. Her hands felt like lies. On Tuesday, James called again. She's been seen with him 3 times this week, he said. Daytime hours. Restaurants, cafes, once at a hotel off Route 62. Room was booked under his name. She stayed 2 hours. He left 10 minutes after her. Want the footage? I didn't respond at first. My vision blurred. My mouth went dry. Yes, I finally whispered. Send everything. Within an hour, I had a folder in my inbox labeled Megan. I clicked it. There they were, photos of her walking into the hotel, his hand on her back, her smile tilted toward him like she was drunk on him. Another of them in a booth at a diner, leaning close, her fingers grazing his wrist. She never touched me like that anymore. I stared at the images until my screen went dark. My reflection stared back at me, hollow and cracked. That night, I couldn't even look at her. I told her I was working late, stayed at the office until 2 a.m., just sitting there, listening to the hum of machines and trying to swallow the hatred building in my chest. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a performance, an alternate life, one I was paying for, feeding, sheltering, while she snuck around with some tech bro who probably thought he was living out some exciting fantasy. I wanted to destroy them both. I didn't want a messy divorce. I wanted an ending she wouldn't forget. I didn't want to scream at her or beg her for answers. I wanted to be the one who walked away while she was still standing in the wreckage trying to make sense of the collapse. Megan had built a second life right under my nose, brick by dishonest brick. And now, I was going to dismantle her first one. Not in a courtroom. Not in front of friends or family. Just her and me, in the silence she never saw coming. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the most agreeable man alive. I cleaned the house, made dinner, laughed at her jokes, took her to her favorite restaurant, the same place I now knew she had taken Travis just months before. I could barely eat, but I smiled through it. I even complimented her dress, the same one she wore in the hotel hallway photo. She didn't flinch. That was when I knew. She didn't feel guilty. Not enough to stop. Not enough to even hide it well. She believed I was too soft to leave her. Too invested. Too old. Too boring. Too safe. She had no idea how close the fire was to her ankles. Said she'd been invited to a nurse retreat, something about mindfulness and burnout prevention. No phones, she said. Totally off-grid. Might not be able to call or text much. I nodded slowly. Sounds healthy, I said. You deserve a break. I even helped her pack. I tucked a note in her suitcase, sweet and supportive, just to twist the knife later. She kissed me goodbye at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning and drove off into the woods with the man she thought would save her. By the time she arrived, I had already left the house. I didn't take much. Just my clothes, my laptop, and the hard drives. I moved into a condo across town that I'd rented a month earlier under a friend's name. I closed our bank accounts, froze her cards, transferred everything legally possible to my separate account. She wouldn't notice at first, not until she tried to buy something more expensive than a gas station snack. I left one card active, just to let her feel like everything was normal. Until it wasn't. While she was sipping wine and pretending her world was perfect, I left an envelope on our kitchen table. It contained 3 photos, her in the hotel, her holding hands in the park, and her smiling in the passenger seat of the Lexus. I left my wedding ring inside the envelope, too. And a note. You lied. I loved you anyway. That's my shame. But this is your ending. When she got back Sunday night, she walked into a house that no longer belonged to her. Her keys didn't work. The utilities had been canceled. The photos were gone. Her clothes remained, but the closet was hollow. No signs of me. Just the letter, resting on the dining table like a final breath. She called me 16 times. Left 8 voicemails. Her voice cracked on the 4th one. She cried on the 6th. On the 8th, she just whispered, please. I didn't answer. I watched the notifications stack up in silence. That silence was the punishment. She wanted a confrontation so she could scream and twist the blame. She wanted chaos. But I gave her nothing. The next morning, I sent Travis an email from an anonymous account. Attached were 10 photos, including the hotel timestamp and the bank statement. I wrote, she's not yours. She was never yours. She's just looking for an exit sign. An hour later, his social media vanished. 2 hours later, she stopped calling me. I heard from James a few days later. He dumped her, he said flatly. She showed up at his place, and he shut the door in her face. Megan didn't go to work for a week. I knew because I checked. She used PTO first, then unpaid leave. Then she just vanished from the schedule. Her sister texted me, asking if she was okay. I didn't answer. Her family would find out soon enough.